Why do Asian parents never say I love you? In American culture, I love you is frequently expressed, whether it's at the end of a conversation, when you drop the kids off at school, or for no apparent reason at all. But no matter the circumstance, I love you just doesn't seem to be in the Asian vocabulary. In fact, exchanging I love yous is something so rare for Asians that you have many videos documenting this moment, which often leads to very emotional conversations. One comment under Stephen Lim's video illustrates how far removed from the realm of possibility saying I love you is for Asians. Once I text my mom, I love you mom, then leave my phone and go out because I'm too shy. About 40 minutes later, there were 11 missed calls and 3 messages from mom. Those messages are, what happened? Are you okay? She thought I was going to end it. LOL. Half of you probably just got culture shock, and the other half is probably thinking, yeah, my mom would do the same. The common answer to why Asians don't say I love you is because it's understood that Asian families are big on acts of service instead. But how did this come to be? And does this behavior of substituting verbal expressions for acts of service impact how we see and express love? There is a lot to unpack here, and a great starting point is Wilkin and Garee's paper on the usage or non-usage of saying I love you. Wilkins and Garee surveyed multiple respondents over a variety of cultures, and it's fascinating how usage of I love you differs. We can see the emphasis on actions, not words, through Sam's response, who is Guyanese and ethnically Indian. Sam says, in a family it is usually understood that your parents love you. Children don't expect to hear it all the time. I don't remember the last time my parents have told me that they love me, but it doesn't bother me. This is because I know that my family loves me by the actions that they do, not by saying 3 words. The emphasis on actions in conveying love is emphasized even more by Pete, who is Syrian American, as he talks about a specific act that expresses love in his eyes, which is sacrifice. Pete says, making sacrifices and putting someone else's needs before yours means a lot to people you love. It's implied here that sacrifice perhaps carries even more weight than saying the words I love you, because that person actually has to give up something to express their love, whereas words don't cost you anything. So from Sam and Pete's responses so far, we have Asians don't say I love you because A, we already know we're loved, B, love is shown through actions, and C, an action that strongly conveys love is sacrifice. Whilst these responses highlight why actions are preferred, it still doesn't answer my question of why there is a reluctance for expressing yourself verbally. What does it take to say I love you, and what is the cost of never saying it? The verbalization of I love you is not treated equally. What do I mean by that? In some cultures, like in America, because I love you is said so frequently, it's appropriate in many situations, whereas in other cultures, you have to be more careful with when and how you declare your love. Here, I'll give you a spectrum of expectations and you can see who you resonate more with. Dina, who is Puerto Rican and American, represents one end of it. Dina says, I was watching TV with my son and he just turned to me and said, Mom, you're the best, I love you. And then her son cuddled up with her on the sofa. I love you is expressed very casually and informally here, and verbalized whenever you feel the love. In the middle of the spectrum, we have Sally, who is Jamaican American, and she says exchanging I love yous is mostly reserved for when it's a special day or if you won't be seeing that person for a while. Finally, on the other side of the spectrum, you have Michael, who is Slovak, who highlights how impactful and precious exchanging these words are. I love you is an event to be remembered by both people. Naturally then, in cultures where I love you holds a very deep meaning, it becomes harder or even socially inappropriate to express this on the regular. What this leads to though are these cultures commonly developing 2 pretty pervasive beliefs. The first one, a sense of distrust at those who say I love you on the regular, if it's meant to be rarely used. In China, for example, folk tales popular in the 19th century would warn girls of men who would seduce them with verbal declarations of love when they lacked noble intentions. The moral of the story, evidently, was to stay away from men who expressed love too freely. The second, a conscious move for individuals to hold back on saying I love you, for fear of diluting the meaning behind it. These 2 sentiments are shared by many cultures where usage of I love you is more reserved, and there is a rich history behind each on how these attitudes developed. It would be almost impossible to go through every culture and explain how their reluctance came to be. But you know what? There is a simpler solution that can halve our problem here. Instead of looking at every Asian culture's reluctance, why don't we first question and understand why American culture values and emphasizes saying I love you on the regular so much? You didn't expect that, did you? Give me 2 minutes to catch the Americans off guard. I promise this is relevant, and then we'll go back to Asia. Potter suggests that saying I love you is such a big deal in American culture because social relationships in America are formed on the basis of personal emotion. For relationships to be legitimized, both parties need to express themselves beyond what they should be doing. For example, you go to pick up your child from school. That's expected of you as a parent. That's the bare minimum. What then is a show of love? Potter emphasizes it's connecting on an emotional level that counts, as she quotes a common bumper car sticker line. Have you hugged your kid today? Picking up your kid is not what matters. Showing that affection you have for them by connecting with them on an emotional basis is. And Potter highlights this again through American patriotism. It's not enough to just have a citizenship and tick that box. To be a real American, you need to harbor the right feelings as well. And this is reflected in the slogan, America, love it or leave it. So a relationship in American culture is very much tied to the expression of emotions, and this phenomenon can be further explained by some social context. Throughout the 20th century, America saw several social movements which promoted a greater expression of emotions like second wave feminism and the men's liberation movement. You also had media directly emphasizing the importance of feelings like the 1960s slogan, make love, not war. Aside from these movements which promoted greater expressions of our feelings, there's something else about American culture that really necessitates these verbal expressions, and that is America's high relationship mobility. Relationship mobility describes how easy it is for people to end a relationship and move on to the next one. In some cultures, dating is taken very seriously, so you would really think twice before ending a relationship, and in other cultures, there's a much lower barrier to both entering and leaving a relationship. American culture is regarded as one with high relationship mobility, so it's easy to form relationships and it's easy to end them as well. Because of this, saying I love you in a relationship is both an expression of how you're feeling as well as a signal of ongoing commitment. Obviously, I love you will be used as reassurance a lot more in newer relationships than in long-standing ones. All these factors combine for emotions to serve an important role in legitimizing the relationship in American culture. However, what this leads to though is individuals often feeling like they have to say I love you in order to sustain the relationship, and Potter terms this as the necessity to feel. Whereas a lot of Asian cultures hold back on saying I love you until the timing is right, or maybe never at all, American culture requires people to say I love you in order to keep a relationship. By this point, you may have realized that the title of this video, Why Asian Parents Never Say I Love You, is quite a westernized or American-centric way of viewing relationships, because you could also argue the opposite. Why do Americans say I love you so much? It's true that some cultures rarely say I love you, but is this a prerequisite for a loving relationship? I guess the only right answer here is it's a prerequisite if it's important to you. With increased globalization, younger generations in particular are seeing how different cultures interact. Especially for those with a bicultural background, we can see some very interesting usages of I love you there. Maria, who's Polish, says that she tells her son I love you every day and he says it back. Because her son is American, being born in the States, she expresses her love to him in English. Maria reflects on how she still means it when she says I love you in English, but somehow she admits that it does feel a little bit different to what the words mean to her in Polish. And it's not that she doesn't mean it when she says it in English, just that it's different. My guess on Maria's observation is that just like how we grasp other conceptual words, the way we see these words being applied has a big influence on how we understand its meaning and usage. If you never hear I love you being used in your native language, but you hear it all the time in English, then your understanding and exposure to when love can be expressed will be very different. It feels okay to say I love you a lot in English because that's just how it's used. But in another language, when you code switch, the expectations around that word also change. On paper, the meanings are equivalent, but are these words really the same? Sue, who is Romanian and ethnically Hungarian, gives us further insight into this with her response. My partner, who is American, feels the urge of declaring his love to me verbally and non-verbally way too often, and he is hurt by my reaction or lack of response. It took me 4 years, but I learned that it is important to him, so I let him say it, and I say it back surprisingly easily. English is not my first, second, or third language. Saying I love you in English means nothing to me. I wouldn't dare say it in Hungarian to anyone. Saying I love you is one thing, meaning it is another. Where Sue's experience is termed by Potter as the necessity to feel, you can also see throughout history the necessity to conceal. In some cultures like China, love is traditionally hinted at, and Potter actually has such a poetic portrayal of this that I have to read it out to you guys. The discussion of love is so muted, so subtle, so subdued, and so indirect that the reader must recognize the emotion and description of mist rising from terraces, expression of sorrow at parting, and references to waterfowl which mate for life. Not gonna lie, this is what gets my my heart racing. Classical Chinese poems were very reserved in showing feelings, and poetry from the Southern Dynasty, which was more expressive compared to other cultures, was criticized even for not being subtle enough. What's prized about these subtle depictions of love is really the indirectness of it, and we all use indirect communication. Some examples are metaphors, sarcasm, and irony, which form about 80% of every edgy 14-year-old's vocabulary. When we use these linguistic devices though, we expect the other person to pick up on the real meaning by reading in between the lines. Indirect communication plays a huge role in many Asian cultures, and it can explain some of the reluctance we picked up earlier when it comes to verbal expressions. Okabe Roichi, Japanese linguist, has a great example on the role indirect communication plays in everyday life. If an American person was to be indirect by asking someone to close the door, they might say something like, "Hey, by the way, the door's open," and the listener will know, oh, okay, what they really mean is "shut the door, please." But Japanese speakers, according to Okabe, would take it a step further and not even mention the door in the conversation. A Japanese speaker might say something like, "Gee, it's cold today," and the listener has to make the jump from it being cold to they want the door closed. Honestly, this indirect communication style is so ingrained in certain cultures that it's normal to speak indirectly even between family. I think my grandparents are probably the worst offenders of this. If it's hot, they won't say, "Can you turn the fan on?" or even, "Gee, it's hot today," as Okabe suggested. What they'll do is gaslight me into thinking I want the fan turned on. So they'll say, "Gee, don't you think it's hot today?" And so of course I'll reply with, "Yep, super hot today," regardless of whether I think it's actually hot before I move to turn the fan on for them. This happens every time they think it's hot, by the way. You would think after the first 10 times my grandparents would just feel comfortable asking me to turn the fan on, but no, I get cued in the same way every time. And even though I pick up hints like this well now, I wasn't always fluent in this mode of communication. The first time I realized indirect speech existed, it was mortifying, and this is how it went down. When I was 11, I would go with my uncle to the gym and I only tagged along for a couple of times. Later, I go to a dinner with him and his friend, and my uncle asked me, "Did you see anyone at the gym with a bigger physique than my friend?" And look, his friend was actually really built, so I thought it was a fair question to ask. I legitimately thought about it, and then 11-year-old me responded, yeah, I did see someone bigger than him. Immediately, my uncle's face kind of soured, and he apologized to his friend. And then he said, "Sorry, she doesn't know how to talk properly." And I remember feeling so ashamed because I realized I gave the wrong answer, and my uncle had to apologize for my blunder. Luckily, that friend was a champ. He just laughed it off and went, "Nah, looks like I still have to work out harder to impress our little one here." So it ended up being fine, but I don't know, I just remember feeling so mortified, and that was my cruel welcome into the world of indirect speech. It was also when I first realized different cultures played by entirely different rules when it came to talking with each other. So in the next part of this video, I'm going to start narrowing the scope of our discussion down to East Asia, where I can bring out some more depth to this topic. East Asia is very heavily influenced by Confucian thought, and Confucius had a lot of thoughts on what proper parent-child relationships looked like, what was appropriate, what wasn't, and how people should behave. East Asian cultures are also very indirect with the way they express themselves, and it goes beyond not saying "I love you." In fact, this indirectness is reflected through the very ways language is structured and spoken. The first time I realized this, it blew my mind, and I know you'll find it fascinating too. Just like how "I love you" holds different meanings in different cultures, communication serves different purposes too. American culture, which is very individualist, sees communication as a way for people to express their own needs. We often hear a lot of relationship advice along the lines of how you need to say what you feel, that people aren't mind readers, and how if you have a problem, it's your responsibility to bring it up and communicate. However, this isn't universal advice. Communication serves a very different purpose in East Asia because of how social relationships are prioritized there instead. If what you're saying is going to harm these relationships, then you need to either not say it or fix the way you say it. This emphasis on preserving social relationships and being respectful of social hierarchies is largely influenced by Confucian philosophy. Confucian thinking has such a big impact on East Asia. Confucian classics were adopted and taught by all three East Asian countries at some point in time, like during the Yi dynasty in Korea, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, and for many dynasties in China. And there were two concepts in Confucianism that really impacted how East East Asians approach social relationships, ren and li. Ren is core to Confucianism. It's often translated as benevolence or humanness, and it's the highest level of moral achievement that people should strive for. Li is propriety, acting appropriately and conforming to social norms. Li informs us on how we should form and maintain social relationships and outlines a social order. How do these two concepts come together? Well, under Confucian thinking, relationships are formed not for your own individual benefit, but for the common good. In order to show proper respect to the person you're talking to, you do have to switch up the way you behave depending on the role, status, or relationship between you and the person you were talking to. In the West, completely changing how you talk to someone and how you act depending on who they are might be seen as fake, because this goes against the code of fairness and equality so core to individualism. However, in the East, the only way to show proper respect under the prescribed social hierarchy was to treat people differently. This difference is known as particularistic versus universalistic relationships, and this differentiation in treatment is actually reflected in our language. For example, in English, we use you to refer to anyone and everyone. There's no polite form of it. I would use the word you if I needed a favor from a sibling or from a complete stranger I'd never met before. However, because Confucianism prescribes proper social relationship etiquettes, which differ depending on rank and seniority and other factors, referring universally to people as you is not gonna fly. Instead, what you'll see is that it's more common to refer to people by their roles. So instead of calling your older brother by their name, you would call them ge in Chinese. It'd be a bit strange or even impolite if you called them by their actual name. Names of professions can also be used to substitute the pronoun for you. This is a big reason behind why Asians stress the role of titles and why you would call your mom mom and not Jan. It's been 24 years and I'm still recovering from that culture shock. Same with professor, it's Songsin-nim, not Mark. A senior at school is addressed as senpai, not po. This is all to make sure that you're treating people with the right respect. Even with people of the same level, you can still be more polite, like adding san in Japanese or shi in Korean to someone's name. So Confucianist ideals have literally evolved the languages to cater for each relationship and to make sure each interaction is carried out with the right amount of respect and propriety. And this seems like a bit of a tangent, but hopefully you'll see now that Confucius beliefs are very much ingrained in East Asian society. So now, looping back to our initial topic of exploration of why Asian parents don't say I love you, there is another deeper reason within East Asian culture of why this occurs, and we've kind of hinted at it already. It's the fact that confessing love so directly can threaten the social hierarchy that Confucius believed was fundamental in all relationships. As Sun puts it, love threatens the social order. An open expression of love shortens the power distance between the parties concerned, making the appropriate maintenance of the relationship difficult. And Potter, in her observations of rural Chinese villages, has a great example of this. The villagers believed that if a father was openly affectionate with his son, then his son would no longer show the same obedience and deference towards him. Open affection therefore damaged the form and strength of a proper father-son relationship. And when I thought about this belief some more, I realized that expressions of love have the power to erode this hierarchy, because you would love a person for who they are and not for their role. You can fulfill the role of being the perfect daughter, but you would want to be recognized and validated for the individual that you are. And at its core, saying I love you does this. It's a recognition that departs from the hierarchical confines of a proper parent-child relationship. Potter takes this idea even further. Instead of emotions being a threat when spoken about, she says, well, that's when it happens and it won't. Potter argues an emotion is never the legitimizing rationale for any socially significant action, and there is no cultural theory that social structure rests on emotional ties. Thus, social relationships persist legitimately without an emotional basis, which basically means in Chinese society, at least when Potter did her study observing villages 35 years ago, Chinese people didn't need words to affirm emotions to stabilize a relationship. Instead, it was all based on behavior. Potter observed relationships being formed through actions, like a man courting a woman in the village by helping her lug logs and being of use through labor. Potter claims that for the Chinese, no emotional statement could provide the wealth of meaning or impact measurable labor provides. Which kind of leads us to what we've been observing this whole time, of acts of service being performed more than verbal expressions. And this was actually something Confucius had always emphasized through the classic admonition, do more, say less. Doing things for each other is the foundation for maintaining relationships, as opposed to expressing emotions. In many ways, verbal expression can even be seen as unnecessary. As Potter much more eloquently puts it, the cultural rationale supposes the continuity of the social order to exist independently of inner feelings. Again, this was 35 years ago, but I think a lot of attitudes highlighted here still manifest in present-day relationships, especially with the older generations. It's probably not as extreme as emotional statements playing no part in a relationship, but the lack of opening up and talking about our feelings is still a core trait of many Asian relationships. On this, Lincoln suggests that restricting emotional expression may serve the purpose of allowing people their psychological privacy. It provides a protective ambiguity. We don't talk about how we feel because it's too upfront, too direct. Yes, in a way we can still relay our feelings through actions, but I think it feels much less vulnerable because of its indirectness, and that then feeds into the idea of psychological privacy. For example, even though giving fruit is understood as an expression of love, a pain point of this expression for many in the Asian diaspora is how after a big argument with their parents where hurtful words might have been exchanged, there's no apology afterwards. The only acknowledgement or de-escalation of the situation is the parent coming in quietly with a fruit platter to indirectly express any apology or regret and to initiate normalcy again. But in these kinds of situations, is this action enough? Sure, the intentions of it are understood, but because it's so indirect, you can never have an actual conversation about what just happened before it's kind of swept under the rug with the fruit apology. As Su describes in his 1981 paper, Chinese underplay all matters of the heart. But does this then get to the point where you have the village's proverb as captured by Potter? The son does not know the mother's heart. The mother does not know the son's heart. I believe there are just certain instances where actions cannot fully substitute words, and I think what we talked about is an example of such a case. In the final part of this video, I want to look at what happens when words are exchanged, when we do get more vulnerable. As younger generations become more open with expressing themselves and their feelings, do parent-child relationships evolve with them? And if so, how? When I told my mom I was making this video, she told me how when she was younger, she kissed her grandmother on the cheek once, and in response, her grandmother slapped her. Times were probably very different then, and we literally just went through why older generations would think the way they do, but I was still stunned hearing this. My mom's story might be from decades ago, but this rejection of affection is still a big thing. 2 clips went viral in China in the 2010s when college students were filmed telling their parents they loved them. The reactions that made the clip viral, one parent responding, "Are you drunk?" after hearing "I love you," and another saying, "I'm about to attend a meeting, don't talk nonsense." Beijing University sociologist Xia Xueluan remarks that these responses highlight some shortcomings of Asian parenting styles, not being good at expressing or responding to positive remarks and defaulting to a negative tone when faced in this situation. These reactions are pretty extreme though. Plenty of Asian parents hear their child say "I love you," and the interaction that comes afterwards turns out to be very, very wholesome. You can find shortcomings with either extreme, from more reserved cultures like East Asia or more direct cultures like the United States. You should probably not say to your kid, "Cut the crap, I have a meeting," if they've just told you they loved you, but also saying "I love you" when you feel nothing and you're just saying it to tick a box also highlights how damaging these expectations can be. The influence of American culture in expressing "I love you" is probably felt slower in homogenous societies, but it's very interesting to see how change is already occurring in families with bicultural backgrounds. Like if your parents were immigrants and you were raised in Australia, your way of thinking would probably differ quite a bit from your parents, including how you see and maintain relationships. In these situations, something very interesting is happening when the younger generation wants to hear and say "I love you" more with an older generation that comes with a more reserved background. And that is, "I love you" is finally being said with parents actively engaging in it, but not in the way you might think. In a survey with Chinese students studying abroad, one respondent mentioned how she talks in Mandarin for around an hour a day on the phone with her mom, except at the very end of the conversation before they hang up, they both say "love ya" in English. Another interviewee mentioned something very similar on how she overheard a conversation in a cafe, carried out wholly in Chinese except for the last part, where the conversation ends with "Baba, love you, miss you." Baba being Chinese for dad, and "love you, miss you" obviously being said in English. This is just so fascinating and exciting to me. Essentially what we're seeing here is that the Chinese term for "I love you," or "aini," just holds too much force behind it because of how rarely it's said within the Chinese culture. Therefore, using a foreign language like substituting it for the English "I love you" puts the expression in the Western context, because the need to vocalize feelings comes from the influence of American culture. Saying "I love you" in a foreign language also creates emotional emotional distance. The meaning is the same, but it doesn't quite feel as intense as it would be in the native language, where its usage is much more restricted. It's pretty much a mix of what Maria and Sue described in saying I love you. Maria used I love you in English, and though she did love her son the same way, saying it in English gave her the freedom to verbalize her affection more frequently. Sue uses I love you in English to fulfill the expectations that come with the culture that speaks it. This usage we're spotting of speaking primarily in the native language and then switching to English to say I love you is that blend of two cultures that are so opposed in values, and I think it's so cool and beautiful to see how we've reached that middle ground. I suspect this practice of subbing in an English I love you would be more commonly seen in families with bicultural backgrounds, like between first-generation immigrant parents and the second-generation immigrant children, or with international students who study abroad, adopt these values and then influence their parents back home, which is what we saw from a couple of the respondents who were surveyed earlier. Then we also just have in general a trend of younger people being more vocal in expressing love as they pick up different values. It's still a very difficult thing, a big culture shock if you will, for Asian parents to open up and say I love you, and to be honest, some parents might never feel comfortable with saying it, which may be very hard for those of us who would really want to hear that from them. But I hope this exploration was able to explain things from their point of view more and helps in making this distance feel more bridgeable. Still, I'm going to choose to look at this situation optimistically. The fact that some parents are starting to reciprocate in what's likely a subconscious but very clever move to express themselves in English is a sign that Asian parents are willing to learn and capable of trying to bridge that gap, however long it may take them to reach that point. I hope this exploration of saying I love you, or lack thereof, in cultures was able to answer some of your questions and maybe raise even more. If you'd like to share any thoughts you have or your personal experience, I would love to hear it. Also, since you made it to the end, here's a piece of trivia. My channel name, AustinTim, is actually the pinyin for aini in Chinese, which means love you. It's also a pun on my real name, Annie. So yeah, whether this is your first time watching me or your 10th, hi, nice to meet you, and if you like this kind of discussion, make sure to subscribe. And if you found this interesting, try my last video on bullying afterwards. It'll give you even more food for thought.
是是的，我也是看你的视频。这最好啊。这个礼拜没有免招，下个礼拜别招。